Welcome back, everyone. This is Rashad Woods with the T.R.O.N podcast. I have one of the most fascinating biographies I've seen since doing this show in a very long time. She's an author. She's been a writer that's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Smithsonian. She's been in Europe. She's been stateside as well, too. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Patti McCracken, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rashad. It's great to be here.
I appreciate that. I got to tell you, we're going to get obviously into your very, very fascinating book, which just stood out to me very, very much. But you have one of the more interesting biographies, that I've seen in quite some time. And I don't want to do all the talking because I'd love to hear you talk about yourself. So Virginia Beach, Florida, DC, Chicago, Europe. And that was just me kind of bullet pointing it. Can you kind of give us the details of that?
I get tired just hearing that. Yeah, born in Virginia Beach, then moved to Florida. And I worked at the Chicago Tribune back in the day when there was a Chicago Tribune. Not for too long before I went to Europe. And I went to Europe to work with journalists from the former Soviet Republic and that kind of thing, this so-called emerging democracies. And it was kind of like this journalism Peace Corps. So people like me, they're mostly Americans or Western journalists at that time. You were just going in after the wall came down, which sounds really quaint now and sounds like a really long time ago, which it was. But just teaching them basic journalism things and then doing other things like post-war Bosnia, being on one little person on a team of people helping journalists with free press advocacy, or sometimes they needed to get to safety. So you were sort of part of one in a chain of many who were putting their heads together for things like that. So, didn't pay much. It paid Peace Corps wages. So, and it was sort of contract to contract. So there was just a lot of, and still are a lot of media nonprofits that are just working to help journalists. There's one called Reporters Without Borders, like doctors. Mm-hmm. So I never worked for them, but they're doing some pretty good work now in Ukraine and stuff like that. So I did that for a long time. And I lived in Europe. I lived in a little village, very east Austria, right on the border with Slovakia. Mm-hmm. And because it was like a really nice little town.
Nice. Yeah. So the crazy part is that even though, you talk about, the wall came down, Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall. When you actually put that in the context, that really isn't that long ago. Right. Like, obviously in a reference of time in life, it's easy to sit back and say X, Y, and Z amount of years ago. But I remember hearing about that as a kid. Right. This is not some, black and white documentary that, this is literally in the 80s. Right.
It's literally in the 80s. And I was an adult then, but I wasn't that old. And I remember when it happened. And I remember it was on my sister's birthday when it was like the big November 9th and like the actual chipping away of the wall, even though it had actually started kind of months before. And I remember being on the road, being on 95, driving from Baltimore to DC, and I had to pull my car over and I just started crying because the wall had always been up in my lifetime. Right. And when your life is young, you can't imagine anything that happened before your time.
Right.
So this wall will always be there,
Exactly. And so, and then I got to ask this question because, you're going into the post-Soviet Union. How welcome were reporters that are so used to handling democracy, being able to report on politicians, political matters, and just your everyday lifestyle? I mean, like for you to do a story over here, I've never been a reporter, so I know that there are things that are involved with it, but there's a free press. Like over there, you're literally teaching people how to actually saying this is, from my understanding, okay, or these are the ropes of doing it. Can you go into detail what that's like?
Yeah, well, as much as things change, they kind of stay the same or they revert back. But to go back to that time, so this would have been early-ish to mid-90s. So not that, a few years, and just a handful of years after the wall came down. And so it would really depend on the age of the journalist you're working with. So the young ones were just wide-eyed and wanted to do whatever so-called Western practices, which would be, actually reporting the story and not hearsay. Right. Older reporters were nervous and didn't want to put their names on stuff, and totally understandable. And now it comes full circle where we come back to the US, and now never in my lifetime, ever would I have worried about free press in America, ever. But now we are. So it was interesting because I go back to those times and I'm like, no, it's all good. But, never be too sure of what, what's going to happen. Never feel so safe and things. But it really had to do with the age of the reporter and, of course, their previous experience, because it's frightening. There was one time when I was where was I? I think I was in Ukraine. Can't remember. And there was a lot of times interpreters are interesting. There was a journalist interpreter who was working with me. And so she's up there. I'm speaking and she's interpreting for me. And during a little bit of a break, she told me that her father was a reporter and had been killed in a car accident. And she did it like car accident with air quotes. And that's just language for, and it was a car accident, but it wasn't an accident. So there was lots of that stuff there, the threat of journalists that, in Russia and such, absolutely huge risk for reporters, especially now.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like being an American there on top of that, the dangers on a day-by-day basis, coming in that type of... You're braver than me, because I don't know if I could have had the stomach to do that.
It actually wasn't in Russia. I was in Algeria for 4 months, and that was a danger for Americans to be there. So, because they had sort of, this don't go anywhere by yourself and, don't walk the same way to work every day and that kind of thing. Because there's just a little bit of but you don't say you get used to it, but you're aware of the dangers. And there are certain, and you're lucky as an American because you do have certain protections that other people don't have in other countries. You do have a State Department that can get you out and things
like that. Yeah. So just really quick, you have a night fellowship too, as well too. I saw that as well too. So just briefly, did you ever major in journalism in college or anything like that? So how did you? Because I see that. And I was curious, like, how do you get your foot into something that goes from local in Chicago to international? So were you reporting on like international things even locally?
No, I started as an obit writer at the St. Pete Times in Florida when I was 19 years old.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and I wasn't even on the main desk. I was in the little satellite office.
Okay.
It was part-time. I loved that job. It was great. It was great place to work. And it's now the Tampa Bay Times, a great newspaper. Yeah, it's a great newspaper. And they always they just have lovely writing in that newspaper and lovely reporting. And as a child, as a teenager, I used to read, there was a guy, I don't know if he's still there. He was a reporter named Tom French, and I just remembered his byline because he was such a great writer. And I was like 15 and 16 years old, and I want to write like Tom French because he's just he wrote this article one time about a Bruce Springsteen concert, and it was just like, I like Bruce Springsteen, and I came to love Bruce Springsteen, but maybe I came to love him because of this article that was just like
vivid, and it reached you so
great. Right. Yeah, really just excellent, lovely writing. Awesome. So I aspired to be like Tom French when I was in high school.
I want to get to the book that you wrote, but I did have a quick question real briefly about you being a reporter and how people report now. Everybody who has a YouTube channel is a reporter now, right? Everybody can suddenly... Have you found that the access to technology and AI has helped or hurt the profession?
I'm no friend of AI, so we'll just leave it at that. As the technology, that's a tough question. You should be a journalist. I'm uncomfortable. I'm very, in a certain way, old school about journalism, is that journalism shouldn't be activism.
Right.
But that ship sailed a long time ago. Now it's really a matter of, it's tough. It's a tough one. And I think that there's a lot of good reporting that's going on still. There's just not a lot of outlets for that reporting that are accessible to everybody.
Right.
Or that everybody will go to. So it's difficult, when they tailor your journalism like as a menu.
Got it.
It's difficult.
I respect that. And I think, that's why I was so curious about that question, because you'll find out there's a nice little happy medium between embracing technology versus like, no, this is the way things are supposed to be done, and not in an entertainment or a auto-generated auto feed to feed your particular impulses kind of a way, right?
Yeah, because that's not healthy journalism necessarily. So it's a matter of, journalism isn't a science, so it's just sort of, there's lots of mistakes made, and there's lots of, just like medicine, you have people who are no integrity, and, but so that's the kind of thing that goes along with journalism, but there has to be some standard and some integrity.
Like
yeah, and there has to always be your eye on the ball of what is the purpose for doing this is for the society,
right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I can tell you one thing: the book that you wrote. I don't want to talk on behalf too much of your book because you're the author of it. But this story was like this was so buzzy to me when I saw the Angel Makers, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm like, I could watch something like this all day, right? I could picture the grainy, the black and white, situation if that took place. I don't want to overtalk that, but the highlighting points that I read about this were so fascinating. So please talk about your book.
It's a crazy story. It's a book called The Angel Makers, Arsenic, a Midwife, and Modern History's Most Astonishing Murder Ring. I'm looking down in case you're doing that.
Yeah, please. We want to get the book on the show.
Yeah. No, I just had to, the subtitle's long. Yeah. But it's a true story about a midwife in Hungary not that long ago, about 100 years ago, who was dispensing arsenic to the neighbor women who she saw were having difficulties with their husbands. And so she would say, "Why are you bothering with him? I have a solution." Yes, it's rough. "Why are you bothering with him? I have a solution." And she literally had a solution. She literally had an elixir in her little apron pocket.
When you check this right now for arsenic in it that I have right here.
That's every man I talk to about this always is like, they get all worried, like, should I be worried about my drink? And the women are like, yeah, sister. So it's like the audience. It's funny. It's to a T. The men get all nervous and twitchy. So yeah, she did this she wasn't the only one. There were other women in the village who were doing this. There were other women in Hungary, other women in Europe. But for her, it was a business, as her grandniece told me. Her grandniece says, yeah, for Auntie Susie, it was a business. And it was. And she made quite a business out of it. And when everything came to light, at least 162 men had been killed. But the prosecutor thinks it was, in the hundreds, 300s, yeah.
So some of the bullet points I saw was that some of them were the disabled husbands from World War One. So they came.
Yeah, some of them. You have to be careful what you read on the internet, and that's what I spent 12 years working on this, 12 years plus on this book, research and writing. I lived not far from the village when I was in Austria, so I had access to the village. I hired a local historian to help me with this, and there is a lot of information out on there's not a lot of information. There's the same repeated information on the internet, which doesn't give much to it. There were not necessarily, they were disabled, but some were disabled. They were disabled in the way that what war does to a man.
Okay. See, because I just saw that bullet point. So that
yeah, and I do appreciate this opportunity to talk about it because this was a village that this was a culture already, and this wasn't just Hungary, everywhere, because women are treated as second-class citizens, where it was standard that a wife would be abused. It was just they used to have a strap on the front, near the front door, called the obedience strap. That wasn't for the dog. Yeah. And so these were women who were used to a certain amount of abuse, just as culturally. But there was also
there's no place to go, right? It's not like there's no women.
Right. You can't call the police.
There's no women's shelter.
You can't call 911. Right. They didn't even recognize it as abuse. They thought, a good husband was one that didn't really beat his wife all that often.
That's terrible.
Right. And then you put alcohol in there, and there was a lot of alcoholism there. But then, you also put young men and young boys, 18-year-old boys, going off to war and fighting on the most horrible front. And they also had no help. They also had no mental health or anything, or any drugs or anything that could help them. And so you send them back into a tiny little house with a little bit more alcohol.
Confined spaces and lots of,
Yeah, so you've got a pretty volatile situation that then gets much more volatile. So that was sort of the situation as it was. So a lot of these women, protecting their children in a way. Some of these women were protecting their children by doing this. And some were, their lives were maybe a little bit more peaceful when their husband left because, they weren't being abused, and then he comes back. And then some were just downright awful and killing very decent people who, so there's all kinds of reasons, and they weren't getting caught. because there are no police in the village. So people were like, why are they doing this? Became, why not?
Oh yeah,
My cousin did it.
came from.
Exactly.
I do have a question,
Yeah.
and obviously advances in science and medicine worldwide have made things like arsenic less likely to end up in a household. Like, what was it used for? How was the access to something like that back then?
Yeah, well, Auntie Susie, who was the midwife, she got it from flypaper. You stick those
Yeah,
strips of flypaper up. Yeah. Well, if anybody's listening, they don't put arsenic in flypaper anymore, so don't let me get any
right.
idea. Yeah. So her way was she would distill it from the flypaper. It was a pretty painstaking process. She took like a few hours where she would just distill it, and then it'd just become this kind of powder. But it was in a lot of things, but it was mostly that, or yeah, catching flies on this blue stuff called flystone, which looks like a pool chalk, looks like that. Yeah, so it was around, and it was easy because it was accessible, and because you really can't detect it, you can't smell it, and it masks, so when they called the doctor, it's like, oh, he's got a stomach ache or he died of a heart attack, and so it could mask anything, and plus they had Spanish flu at the time, and people coming back with war injuries, like, oh, he died from,
Mixed right in with
and
it.
so it was real easy to just say he died of something else.
So obviously, and I took notes about this because it was so fascinating to me. So it looks like in 1929, and various family members and friends of Auntie Susie, decided they were going to poison X,
Mhm.
Y, and Z and do X, Y, and Z. How did word start getting around that there could be something deeper than just random deaths?
Well, they had been suspicious for quite a while, but you never imagine your next door neighbor's doing something, or you never imagine your wife is going to do something. Um, but people were sending anonymous notes to the town clerk, who was like the mayor, kind of like mayor, and he just didn't believe them. And he was of sort of the gentry class, so he felt he was a step above these peasants, and that, oh, these silly peasants are just being
Annoying.
dramatic,
Right.
annoying him because he wanted to go hunting and he didn't want to bother with it. And so when literally a new sheriff was in town, when there was a new town clerk appointed, he found a bunch of anonymous notes. And at the same time that he was finding these anonymous notes, an attempted murder happened in a neighboring village, and it was connected to Susie. Right. And so that guy didn't die, and he reported it. So it was kind of this perfect storm of things that kind of go, okay, now we're paying attention. Yeah. And there was one that had happened several years earlier that the doctor was very suspicious about. It was a friend of his, and he's like, this is not right. I just saw this guy last week. Something's going on. Right. And he's asked for an autopsy in the main town, and they were having money troubles. It was after World War I. The city didn't have money to do, to investigate the deaths, so they said no. And that kind of came back to bite them, because people were like, you knew about this, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and you could have prevented all these other deaths,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what was the aftermath of all of this? Was there, okay, so obviously I saw some people were sentenced to jail, some people were sentenced to death. Did it start to fade away from public memory that this particular instance happened?
No, it was massive internationally. And this was, and you think about it, this was just the time when radio was coming around, and they had foreign reporters there and stuff. It was massive. New York Times covered it. Chicago Tribune covered it. I mean, it was huge. And the trials were enormous. They had to sell tickets to control the crowds. I mean, people were out for blood for these women. And the newspapers were not kind to them. The newspapers called them all kinds of horrible. They didn't call these women, they called all peasant women were horrible, And so people were out for blood. It was incredibly reported. It was awful because they had public hangings, and even gross. It was awful, but at the public hangings, it was really macabre because people were invited and they had to wear tux and gowns.
Really? It's you see footage and videotape of what they let the public just kind of consume for entertainment, and it kind of makes your stomach churn a little bit, right?
It does. It does. It's disgusting that this.
You see kids attending like a public execution. You're just like, oh my god. Well,
I know.
So you're in that area when you're a reporter, and so how long did you actually become knowledgeable about? You always knew about these things when you were based in that area, and then how did your research start on this?
I was just like anybody. I was looking for a story to do. I was just on a Sunday afternoon, I remember it. And I'm like, there was this one little thing on it at that time. This was like way long ago. And it was kind of snarky the way it was written. It was kind of tongue in cheek, but I thought, well, I'm just curious about it. And my neighbor was a photographer, really great photographer at the time. I mean, he's still a great photographer, but he's not my neighbor anymore. But I said, Harold, do you want to go on a road trip? And he's like, yeah, that sounds good. And so we started with a road trip, and I had an interpreter with us, and it just kind of went from there. I just at first did an article on it, and then it just stayed with me. I found myself, talking about it at parties and stuff. And I just thought, wow, so I sold it as a proposal. Nonfiction, you sell to a publisher before the book is written, and you sell it like an idea of it. And so I sold it to the publisher. And then when I went into the archives and started doing it, was scary because I felt like I'd gone fishing and I caught a whale. It was like, this is huge. I don't know what to do with all this. I've never written a book before. Right. Oh my God. And it was great to have that information, but it was really
like an out-of-body experience. Like, I'm really writing about this situation.
And I'm like, me? I've never written more than 1,500 words at a time, and now you wanted me to write 100. I just didn't know where to. I was like, I am way out of my depth with this. I don't recommend anybody do that.
So when you're writing this, were there great? You talked earlier that there was a great granddaughter. Were there other descendants that were openly knowledgeable about this particular situation that took place?
It was interesting because when I went there originally for the article with Harold, the photographer, and we were told, go over to the librarian. She knows about it. And so we went over to the librarian, and we're sitting at this long table. It was weird because we were all sitting. It was like, she was a really forceful personality. So some people have that energy where you're just like, and we were like three of us sitting at this table, and she's way at the top of the table. And it felt like the force of her energy had like pushed us down. And we're sitting, and the interpreter said, hold on a second. And the interpreter turns to me, and she said, this librarian, she just told me that she's the grandniece of the midwife.
Wow.
Right. So she didn't lead with that.
Of all people.
And it took her an hour and a half to get to that. And that blew me away because that's when I really realized that everybody in this little village is descended from a victim or a perpetrator or both.
Yeah, no doubt.
Everybody was affected. So what they know about it, everything was swept under the rug. So she found out the grandniece was also not her husband, but her ex-live-in boyfriend. She said, oh yeah, I was reading about it. And she goes, oh, and I realized why my ex-boyfriend's mother was orphaned.
Oh my God.
Because both of her, the mother of her killed her dad and then went to prison. But they didn't know it. She had to read it from an outside source, this Canadian Hungarian historian who did it. I mean, imagine that much trauma and that much shame.
It's unbelievable. And I say this very respectfully about the situation. That kind of, because it happened right after World War I and then World War II happens right in between, a story like that gets really, really lost about something like that.
Right. Exactly. Because World War II, for us, World War II started later, but for them it started, they had Mussolini in 1925 and they had, so they had all that stuff going on right quicker, than we did. And so they were dealing with all kinds of junk that, right away. Right. And already traumatized by one war and about to be traumatized by another one. And then the stock market crashed, so they had, that affected them too. Struggle.
And so I didn't even hear, but I think I heard about it in passing at one point, just in the context of maybe inside of something, but I didn't realize the depth of it until I started, looking about what you wrote. I was like, wow, this is sandwiched between, these two cataclysmic events,
Yeah. And that's why we probably didn't hear about it. And I have to say mine is the book that actually tells the story. It's the first time it's ever been told in this depth in Hungary or anywhere in the world. So I'm honored to be able to tell the story because as difficult as the whole situation was, this was a community that was deeply affected by it. And these were women most of them were just struggling and would not have otherwise done this. And sometimes Auntie Susie did it for them, quote unquote, without their okay.
Right.
Yeah, and they suffer tremendously under this.
So just briefly still on this topic, are there any historical markers, or monuments to kind of say that this is what happened, or is the town kind of like moved on?
The town hasn't moved on. I think the town wants to move on. but it's sort of like if you think about Germany, the first thing you think about is Hitler. So this town, the first thing you think about is the angel makers. So I don't think they'll ever really be out from under it. But if my book can help give greater context and greater emotional truth and understanding of what happened, maybe that will help in some way people understand that this kind of could have happened anywhere.
Well, it's crazy
in a certain situation, you know.
It's interesting you say that because I obviously I couldn't tell whatever happened everywhere and every place on Earth, but I could say with pretty decent confidence this is not the only situations that something like this has occurred, right?
And this was kind of, I mean, it's bizarre how relevant it is today, and it's bizarre how much more relevant it is even than when I started writing it. This is kind of their Me Too. This was their, act of desperation, and they had been ignored, and they're still ignored. There's still no police force in that town.
Not yet. That even now, 100 years later, there's no police force in that.
No, even by law, there has always supposed to be two appointed there, but there still isn't. So, they just had to fend for themselves.
That's a deep story. That's a really deep story. And that, for you to be there and be able to actually have that interview and interaction, see those places where everything took place, I just want to say that that's amazing, and I hope that the book does tremendously well, because these stories are always, number one, need to get out. Number two, they're just, hearing about that is so interesting, right? It's so interesting.
Yeah.
To find out, different cultures and to immerse yourself in that for 12 years. That's amazing.
Well, I owe it to my historian assistant who laid all the groundwork, and they trusted him because he was, spoke like them and had the same background as they did. But this could happen anywhere. And I think I wrote it, even though it's all a true story, I wrote it as if it were a novel, because I didn't want it to be dry facts of just like this happened. Right. That's why it took so long to report. That's why it took 12 years to really report, because I had to kind of recreate the DNA and find out exactly what happened and what was doing what, and weed was growing in their backyard and that sort of thing. But I felt it was important to really tell the stories, because so we can relate to it. You can relate to, brothers and fathers going off to war, or you becoming 18 and going, oh gosh, I have to sign up for the draft. And whether you are actively putting yourself in the military or being drafted, still a monumental thing.
I never served, and I always give props to everybody who did and continues to do so. But when you said that, it was amazing, because I graduated from high school in 2001, right? And, and 9/11 happened 3 months after I graduated. So I had a friend, I'm in college, I'm in my dorm, and then I'm messaging him, in like February, March time, and, he had already gone to the Army, and I'm in my dorm room at Michigan State. And he's like, I'm in Baghdad, right? And you're just like, I'm like, holy, like, yo, in this short amount of time, we went from having, I don't even remember what class we had together, to this guy's in Baghdad, right? And here I am, and so like that dynamic of what you talked about is like, 1 minute you're a kid, and then you're in not only just adulthood, but in you're a soldier in the Army.
That's right. And so you've got friends signing up, which is just mind-blowing. But it's also the fact that there is the threat that, you won't sign up, but the government will sign you up. So you as a guy would have to have that worry. Is this going to get bigger? And am I going to have to go there? Absolutely. So, I find your story completely fascinating. And just briefly, what are you doing stateside now? Stateside, still promoting the book. I'm a ghostwriter and I'm a writing coach, and sort of looking at sort of other options related to the book without sort of going further into that. And looking for the next big story.
Dope, that's dope. And like I said, if you uncover anything that's anywhere close to something like that, I would love to read about it, because stories like that deserve to be told. And a lot of things get buried over the course of time. And to be honest with yourself, Wikipedia is not always the truth, you did your research on this.
Yeah, Googling something, this is my big thing, as people say, I Googled it. That's not research, that's Googling. Right. You got to go to the person who was actually there or actually did the research and taught.
And I'm sure there's a lot of writers who that's not true.
It drives me crazy. That's my little pet peeve of the day. I'll let that be known. Googling is not researching, but I get the you're looking into it, you're reading about it, but it's not It's not always there, but on the surface, you've got to talk to the people. And there's people that you talk to in my line of work where it's like a lot of them are historians, and they're like, I wrote about this and nobody's ever asked me. I really want to talk about it. I'm like, yes, tell me what kind of medical devices did they use? And they're so excited to talk to you. And they have all this information, and they're actually pretty animated people because they live in that
Absolutely.
world. That's why they became historians, and they studied that one thing. And so they're really fun to talk to, and they bring it alive for you. So I met a lot of great historians of these really arcane topics, that at a party they might be boring, but for somebody like me, it's like, that's so cool that they had all this stuff, or that's so cool that they did this kind of thing.
LexisNexis was my friend in college, right? So
yes,
that was my friend.
Yes.
So
good journalism.
It was awesome. Yeah. So I know I've taken up more than enough of your time. Your background is absolutely exquisite. I wish it looked the same where I was at right now. It's nice and gray and 40 degrees and pretty. It is nice. I'm very lucky today. So did you have any questions for me before we wrap this up? And again, I appreciate your time so much.
No, I'm excited now. I want to sort of hear more of your episodes. I like the idea of the randomness of nothing. It brings everything.
And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't smart enough to do, I had to talk to people smarter than me. And that's why I did this show, because I'm the curious guy, and the people who have the answers to the question I was seeking are people like you.
Curiosity is the best thing. I bet your teachers loved you when you were in school.
We're going to leave it at that, because I won't, any of my former teachers watching you're the first that probably said that. But no, I talked a lot.
No, I'm sure there are ones that they were like, yeah, he's the guy. Not the math teachers. The math teachers never want you to be curious. They're like, it is what it is. Don't ask me.
The answer is the answer, so to speak.
So, all right.
Absolutely. Back to Jack, and I appreciate your time so much. It's been awesome.
Likewise. You too.